بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. We continue in our series on the Hadith compilation and authenticity. Last week we began discussing the origin of the Hadith writing, Tadween al-Hadith, at what time it came in. And we explained with evidence that the ahadith were written in the time of Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam with the Sahaba, and then the 2nd century and the 3rd. And we also showed some of those manuscripts or books are still with us and are collected and preserved, chains and the written copy. Today we want to move on to the second part, which has to do with more about these books, earlier ahadith compilations, their names and narrators. Because we spoke about the fact that it was written, but who transmitted these ahadith? Who are they? Who are these imams? And then after that, we're going to focus mostly on the hadith transmission at isnad, right? The chain transmission. So to begin, we said that there are many books written, something like more than almost 100, if not more, in the 1st century alone. And some researchers have listed all these different names of these books. So I'll quote here Sheikh Diyar Rahman Azami, rahimahullah, in his Kitab al-Jami' al-Kamil fi Hadith al-Sahih al-Shamil. And this book is written by this contemporary scholar who was originally from India, and he was in Medina. He died maybe 2020. And this scholar, he compiled the entire hadith, all hadith sahihah, in his estimation, in one book. And we'll talk about later what was he trying to achieve. But in the muqaddimah of the book, he has lots of good information about hadith and the sciences. So he says, for example, there were so many books that were written at the time of the Sahaba, and he lists maybe 100-something of them from that time until the 3rd century. Examples, he says, there was Majmu'a Sa'ad bin Ubadah. Sa'ad bin Ubadah, radiallahu anhu, he had a majmu'a, a collection of hadith that he wrote or is written on his behalf. And he died 16 after the Hijrah Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We mentioned, for example, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. He had also a majmu'ah, a collection of ahadith, and Ibn Mas'ud died 32 Hijri. And then he goes down by mentioning all these different ones. So differently, the Sahaba, they had many. And then later you keep going until you get to closer to the end of the 1st towards the 2nd century, where we get some of the more popular names of the books. Musannaf ibn Abi Shaybah, for example, is one famous collection of ahadith and athar written by Ibn Abi Shaybah, the famous hadith scholar narrator. He died 235 Hijri. So on his list is like maybe 42. He comes in around for number 42. Another example, Musannaf Abdul Razak al-San'ani, right? Again, another earlier compilation. He came before Ibn Abi Shaybah even. And that's a very important book, as we see later, because Orientalists studied it. Orientalists studied the Musannaf Ibn Abi Abdul Razak al-San'ani to prove whether or not hadith was sahih. And we'll see what the outcome was of that. Some other examples, we know Musnad Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah, very famous, still with us, all these books with us, but his book is most popular because of how many hadith in there. He died 241 Hijri. So all these famous books, you can find the list if you go to the beginning of that book, al-Jami' al-Kamil, and you just look at the different names and the years. So time of the Sahaba, and year after year after year, you get another book. And the trend is, as time progresses, more books. Why? Because the scholars are continuing to compile what they heard, whereas the Sahaba were more in memorization, less in writing. So this will find to be a trend. As earlier you go, you find more memorization and less writing. And as time goes on, more writing and with memorization. Now in terms of narrators, then of course we're going to expect the Sahaba to be the most foremost of narrators of hadith. And this is truth. That the Sahaba narrated the hadith of Rasulullah, some of them more than others. Now someone may say, how come all the Sahaba didn't narrate a hadith? Number one, some of them were more busy. For example, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq is the most knowledgeable of the Sahaba, bittifaq, by agreement. But his hadith is so small compared to Abu Hurairah. So some people, when they look at this, they say, this doesn't make sense. And we'll see later, those who accuse Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu of anything is because they didn't understand why he had so much ahadith. But we know that some of the Sahaba, like Abu Bakr, he was a Khalifa. And he reigned for 2 years, then he passed away. So he was busy with the Khalifa from riwayah, so therefore he couldn't do what Abu Hurairah could do. Not to mention, in the lifetime of Rasulullah, Abu Hurairah was more free, to collect the hadith and to memorize them. So these kinds of discussions are not a big deal for the Muslims. But for non-Muslims, they ask this question. Why, for example, there's a Sahabi who accepted Islam in the year of Khaybar. Abu Hurairah became Muslim in 7th Hijri. And you have Abu Bakr, Siddiq, and Umar who were from the time of Mecca. So we answer like this. They knew the hadith, but they were sufficed by the other Sahaba, which is the second reason. They were busy, and number two, sufficed. Abu Hurairah was doing the work for them and narrating, and then other Sahaba. So there's no need for them to narrate what they already knew. An example, Umar radiallahu anhu, he knows many hadith. But sometimes he would ask the Sahaba, anyone know a hadith about this topic? He might know a hadith, but they narrated, and sometimes he didn't know it. But if he didn't narrate a hadith, doesn't mean Umar didn't know something all the time. Rather, sometimes he knew something, but they narrated. And they left it to them because those other Sahaba were more, either younger or had more time or ability to write. And that's another one. Some Sahaba had more hadith because they wrote, and some didn't. Example, Abdullah ibn Amr al-As, he wrote many hadith. So he knew more hadith than, let's say, others, because he wrote and they didn't write. Abu Hurairah, even one narration, he mentioned that Abdullah knows some things we don't know, because he wrote and Abu Hurairah didn't know how to write. Abu Hurairah was illiterate, he didn't know how to write, so he would only memorize. So the benefit we take from this, these reasons are found in the books. So if someone were to ask you, I don't understand Abu Hurairah's collection of hadith or his number, it doesn't make sense, we're going to see quickly that that's a very weak argument. So who are the famous ahadith narrators from the Sahaba? The ulama mentioned the most famous of them being number one, Abu Hurairah, who is number one, followed by Ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Umar, and number three, Anas ibn Malik, and then number four, Ibn Abbas. Well, if you want to go in order, Aisha first, Aisha before Ibn Abbas. So we'll go in order, Abu Hurairah, and then Ibn Umar, and then Anas ibn Malik, then Aisha, and then Ibn Abbas, and then Jabir ibn Abdullah, and then Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. All of these are to consider the top of foremost narrators of hadith, in that order. Abu Hurairah, Ibn Umar, Anas, Aisha, Ibn Abbas, Jabir ibn Abdullah, and Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. And when we look at the numbers of their narrations, it's very clear that they overcome or they surpass the Sahaba in narration. Right? So this is in terms of narration. And later down you can get Ibn Mas'ud and Abdullah ibn Amr and As and others. So the ulama, they mentioned them. For example, in Alfiya Suyuti, he mentioned the famous lines. وَالْمُكْثِرُونَ فِي رِوَايَةِ الْأَثَرِ أَبُو هُرَيْرَ يَلِيهِ إِبْنُ عُمَرَ وَأَنَسٌ وَبَحْرُ كَالْخُدْرِ وَجَابِرٌ وَزَوْجَةُ النَّبِيِّ. So he mentioned Imam Suyuti in the lines in Alfiya, lines 661 to 662, that the foremost narrators from the Sahaba are Abu Hurairah, followed by Ibn Umar, then Anas, then Ibn Abbas, who is nicknamed the Bahr, the ocean of knowledge, and likewise Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, then Jabir ibn Abdullah, and Aisha, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ. So some of the ulama, they mentioned these abiyat to help remember them. Of course, Suyuti, he wrote them, and others have similar lines. وَالْمُكْثِرُونَ فِي رِوَايَةِ الْأَثَرِ أَبُو هُرَيْرَةَ يَلِيهِ إِبْنُ عُمَرَ وَأَنَسٌ وَالْبَحْرُ كَالْخُدْرِ وَجَابِرٌ وَزَوْجَةُ النَّبِيِّ. So if someone memorizes it, he will know the major narrators. But the question now, what are their numbers? What did they memorize? Famously, the scholars, they say, Abu Hurairah narrated 5,374 ahadith. 5,374. And this is based on the musnad of a famous Spanish scholar of hadith, Baqi ibn Makhlad. Baqi ibn Makhlad, he's a scholar who studied with Imam Ahmed during the time Ahmed was in house arrest. He came from Al-Andalus. So his musnad is huge, but we don't have it in full copy, only a little bit we have today. But if you looked at the numbers that the scholars who did have access to it, they said that Baqi ibn Makhlad, he has 5,374 ahadith from Abu Hurairah. But some of the contemporary scholars challenge that number, saying that the number is correct in terms of asanid wal mutun, but not mutun by themselves. If you actually want how much he memorized bil matan, it's 1,236. 1,236. 1236. That's how much hadith Abu Hurairah narrated. A hadith, not asanid. The reason why the 5,374 is a matan And every time you add a new isnad, is a new hadith. And why is this information important? This is the research of, again, Diyar Rahman, Sheikh Diyar Rahman al-Adami, his master's, he did Abu Hurairah in defense of him, and he's the first one to actually calculate every single hadith Abu Hurairah has, and refuted the doubts, and he came to this conclusion. It's not 5,000 by itself. That's 5,000 asanid wal matun. So obviously we learned last week, and we remind ourselves, if we have one hadith and multiple asanid, every time you have a new isnad, it's a new hadith. The scholars used to count it like. So one hadith has two isnads, you count as two hadith, even though it's one matan. You guys with me? This is very important because later on somebody's going to ask you, where are all these hadith? Go to Muslim Ahmad, you don't see it. And it also dispels the doubt of those foolish who say, how can Abu Hurairah narrate 5,000 hadith in 4 years? So first of all, it's 1236. So they don't even have the number right. And secondly, we tell them it's also possible. How many hadith per day, per year? Some of the scholars say, if you look at the days he's with the Prophet ﷺ, how much he did per day, it's very possible. But these are the kinds of nonsensical arguments we find today. So as Muslims, we have to be ready to defend Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu against these doubts. For these are the ones that they spread to the awam, the lay people, and say, Abu Hurairah, I don't know. Who doesn't know Abu Hurairah's status? Only a jahil, an ignorant person. But when you look at the numbers, also becomes so much manageable. When you say it's 1,236 ahadith, matan, mutun only, versus the different chains of transmissions. And he had many students, so that also explained why he had so many asanid. Next, we have Abdullah ibn Umar, radiallahu anhuma, who narrated, according to the same Musnad, Baqi ibn Makhlad, it's 2,630. So Ibn Umar, it's 2,630, 2630. 2630. And so you can see that he has significantly less compared to the asanid. Again, if we're going by asanid here. So the footnote for all the numbers I'm going to mention, these are not the true numbers just on the matan. This is based with isnad, different isnad, asanid. So Ibn Umar, 2630. As for Anas ibn Malik, he served the Prophet for 10 years. And the scholars say he narrated 2,286 ahadith. 2286. And he had many students because he lived very long. So 2286, that's Anas ibn Malik anhu. Al-Mu'mineen Aisha anha, she narrated 2,210. 2210. And many of the hadith came by way of her nephew, Urwa ibn Zubayr, radiallahu anhu, or rahimahullah. Since he narrated a lot from her. So 2210. Again, each one of these numbers are with the asani, different asani. But if you go just look at the matan, we can make them smaller, right? The number. Ibn Abbas is reported 1660. 1660, 1,660 hadith. And Jabir ibn Abdullah, 1,540, 1540. So Jabir ibn Abdullah, 1540. And lastly, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, radiallahu anhu, 1170, 1,170. So looking at these numbers, you can see that these are clearly the foremost narratives of hadith. Other Sahaba narrated 1, 2, 3, or 10, or dozens. And if you go to different books of Masanid, you can see their name and you see how much they narrated. And these include ahadith which are either authentic or weak. Right now we're just talking about numbers, not authenticity. That will come later. So when you look at this, you can see clearly the Sahaba were narrating prolifically or abundantly in time of Rasulullah, and later those who came after copied that. But we'll see later that some people, when you look at the hadith, they need to understand that the Sahaba, the amount of hadith they knew, they narrated to their students, and those who took from them and then narrated those after them, it goes in the chain. We're going to see there's a pattern of how the chain progresses over time. And that leads to our next topic, the isnad system. So this is one of the most important things that a student of Islam and Hadith should know, how asanid, chains of transmissions, work. So when we say something has an isnad, it just means a chain of transmission. So-and-so heard from so-and-so, heard from so-and-so, until you get to the matan. Whether it be hadith, or athar, narration, or anything, any story, that's the isnad. So chain of transmission. And matan, which is the text. So every hadith has two parts. Both of them are needed for the authenticity of hadith. You need to check the isnad and you need to check the matan. So both. And this is important because we see later the Orientalists, they criticize the Islamic scholars, thinking that they only check the asanid for authenticity, as if we didn't know anything about matan criticism. We do. Jarh wa ta'deel has to do with the matan. Ilal has to do with matan, to do with the hidden defects of chains and the texts. So this will come later. But you can't say hadith sahih if the chain is authentic only. And I'm going to show that later. Why is this the point? So now that we know that everything of the hadith, they come with asanid, likewise the Quran has, the riwayat, the qira'at, they also have asanid. And even books of fiqh, we have asanid, right? This is the hallmark of our deen. Islam is known for change and transmission. This is us. Our deen is حدثنا وأخبرنا. قال فلان or Shaykh so on. So that's our deen. And the reason why it's important is because Ahlul Hadith, they popularized this. That the hallmark of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah specifically, because Ahlul Hadith are the Salafiyun. We narrate and we memorize the Hadith and we know about them. Compared to the people of misguidance who do not have asanid to change the transmission, nor do they care about them, nor do they practice authenticity based on the conditions of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The first important point regarding asanid is the history of the isnad. Where did it come from? Or when did it come? And this is the first point every Muslim should know. When did the Sahaba and the Salaf start asking for the isnad? Imam Muslim, he narrates in the Muqaddimah, in his introduction, hadith number 27. And Ibn Sirin, Muhammad ibn Sirin, rahimahullah, he said, لم يكونوا يسألون عن الإسناد. They, the Salaf, these teachers and the Sahaba, they never used to ask about the isnad. فلما وقعت الفتنة, when the fitna occurred, قالوا سموا لنا رجالكم. They used to say, name for us your men. فينظر إلى أهل السنة فيؤخذ حديثهم وينظر إلى أهل البدع فلا يؤخذ حديثهم. So they used to look at the narrations. So if it was from Ahl Sunnah, they would take it. If it was Ahl Bid'ah, they would reject it. So this narration is authentic and it teaches us a number of things. Number one, when the isnad came. فَلَمَّا وَقَعَتِ الْفِتْنَةِ. What's this fitna? We have to explain what's this fitna he's talking about. And number two, we also learned the usage of the term Ahl Sunnah Jama'ah was in the time of Sahaba and Salaf. Some people today would say, when did Sahabis Ahl Sunnah? When they need to differentiate themselves from Ahl Bid'ah, like the Khawarij and the likes of them. So the scholars of Ahl Sunnah Jama'ah and Muhaddithun clearly say the fitna mentioned by Ibn Sirin is talking about the fitna between Ali and Muawiyah radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma. That both of them, when they had that dispute in relation to the Khilafah and the death of Uthman, it's referring to that time period, not later. Some of the Orientalists, or many of them, they calculated the date, I think maybe deliberately, in order to say that hadith started late. Why? Because they're saying that the hadith were recorded later and the isnad came 120. So they brought the narration of Umar ibn Aziz last week, and they also brought this fitna and said the isnad was projected or started this time, so they used to project the hadith backwards. We're going to see who came up with this idea and this nonsense. So they said things like it was the fitna of the Umayyads and fitna of this, and tried to give different numbers and dates. All of it's wrong. Why and how do we know it's the fitna Ali and Muawiyah at that time period? Because in the same Muqaddimah, Imam Muslim, narration number 24 now. Take a look. Just before Ibn Sirin talked about this, Abu Ishaq, rahimahullah, when the narrators of hadith, he said, when they narrated things about after Ali, and the people of misguidance, or people of ta'assub, and we know who he's indicating here, the people like the Rafidah, who were coming around saying things about Ali that were not true, or the Khawarij who were making up things about him which are not true. He said, Abu Ishaq, when they narrated things after Ali, may Allah be pleased with them, a man from the companions of Ali said, may Allah curse them, did they corrupt every type of knowledge? And so he's talking about here the beginning of the Rafidah and their misguidance and lies of Ali. So here, this narration, number 24, is the evidence for the ulama that the fitna, لما وقعت الفتنة, is the fitna Ali Muawiyah. Hence, it shows that it begins the time of the latter first generation, or the middle of first generation, not the late, right, first century or after it. And the reason why this is important data, when we get to the doubts of the Orientalists, as soon as you know this, you know the first mistake. That they claimed the fitna was something else, bidun dalil. So we asked them, where did you get that historical fact? He said, they have no proof. And the reason why they do this, brothers and sisters, is because they already have suspicion about our ulama. They think our ulama are always lying. Today we'll see that everything the ulama have said is correct. So we have proof for our point. So this is important information. So, فَلَمَّا وَقَعَتِ الْفِتْنَةِ When the fitna happened to Ali Muawiyah and there became some kind of lies and false narration, they used to say, سَمُّ لَنَا رِجَالُكُمْ Name for us your men. And let's see the isnad, who do you have? It doesn't mean that there was no isnad beforehand. Because how could you name something you didn't have? So scholars, they say that everyone used to know different narrations that they memorized, but they never asked for a narration as a condition. And isnad, they never asked each other, bring the isnad. So Sahaba sometimes would say, did you hear a hadith? And they would say yes, and they narrated. And sometimes they would narrate that they heard from Rasulullah ﷺ, and sometimes they wouldn't say it because it's given. Whoever they got it from is clear Rasulullah ﷺ. But when the fitna happened, no. Now we have to be careful. Because there's some people who are lying and saying things are true. Ali said he didn't say, or Rasulullah ﷺ said he didn't say. So that's the first benefit. An example now of an isnad. For example, Imam Bukhari in his Sahih, hadith number 2749. قال Imam Bukhari رحمه الله حدثنا سليمان بن داود أبو الربيع حدثنا إسماعيل بن جعفر حدثنا نافع بن مالك ابن أبي عامر أبو سهيل عن أبيه عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال آية المنافق ثلاث إذا حدث كذب وإذا اؤتمن خان وإذا وعد أخلفه. So this is an example of a hadith with its isnad. And of course, the beginning when you hear حدثنا or أخبرنا or أنبأنا or an or an, all these are just different siyagh, ways of narrating how you heard. And the most correct opinion, they all have the similar meaning. Although there is some strength and weakness versus each other, some argue this. But this is the chain, the beginning. So Sulaymaan ibn Dawood Abu Rabi' heard or narrated to us from Ismail ibn Ja'far, who narrated to us like that. And this point of the isnad is for us to prove that in order for this hadith to be from Rasulullah, we have to check the chain and we check the matan. We check both. And we'll see later how that works. But this chain of transmission, for example, is just one of the many that we have. And if you go to, for example, Muslim has a similar hadith, he has his chain, different isnad. And maybe another book has a different isnad. So the same hadith, three different asanid, for example, you will say three hadith, and each one we will check for its authenticity. Bukhari, Muslim, we know are authentic, so we don't have to worry about that. A fa'idah, just a side benefit regarding narrating hadith. Some of the ulama, when they narrate the hadith, they say you have to put the word qala between حدثنا. So قال Imam Bukhari رحمه الله قال حدثنا سليمان بن داود أبو الربيع قال حدثنا. So we have to ask the question, is that correct or is that not correct? So if you want more, go to the kitab Muqaddimah Ibn Salah, he mentions this. But in Tadrib al-Rawi, Suyuti says not correct. You don't have to. And he says because if you say أخبرنا or حدثنا, it means قال لنا. And he said, I always used to think this. Imam Suyuti said, I used to feel this is correct. You don't have to. And he says, I asked one teacher and he didn't have a good answer. And then I found Ibn Hajar, his teacher, he has some written work in which he said, you don't have to. And he said, Alhamdulillah. And the reason I'm saying is some people get strict and say, oh, you missed qala, did you hear it? It's like, okay, it's not that big of a deal, because some of the ulama, they said you don't have to. And I'm saying that because if we said this today, someone will say, astaghfirullah, you read the hadith wrong. So we know we didn't, right? So inshallah, just a fa'idah, just in case someone will say you didn't say qala. There's a difference of opinion there. طيب, let's look at now the asanid in time of Sahaba. Sahaba used to use the isnad whenever they heard something from Rasulullah in order to let the other Sahaba know that they heard. For example, there's a narration in Muslim, Imam bin Tha'laba, he came to Rasulullah saying, Muhammad, your messenger came to us and told us. So this shows that whenever Rasulullah used to send a messenger or written work, they used to say things like, we heard from your messenger who told us that you said. And this was the common practice of the Arab to narrate what they heard. So the Sahaba, it was well known, scholars say that they used to know that isnad itself just means who did you hear from and when did you hear it or how did you hear it. But when this fitna happened now we're talking widespread asanid. Everyone has to bring their isnad now. Therefore you need an isnad and you need to be someone who narrated and heard. You can't just be someone who just made up things. Because the ulama, as soon as they find that there's no corroboration for your report, it's rejected. And this is very important. Asanid is not just someone just says, قال حدثنا, he made it up, and everyone will say, mashallah, it's authentic. No. They're going to check. Let me go check everyone else who heard the same hadith and see if there's discrepancy in the chain, or do you even meet the teacher, or does anyone know you? And the reason why this is important is we'll see asanid, they don't go backwards in terms of the way that people imagine. The hadith existed and we made up the isnad. No. The way the Salaf, they used to work, they didn't know about the matan until they first found the isnad. So for example, someone comes to you today and says, there's a hadith. I don't know about that hadith. You have to give me the chain, they have to follow it to figure out. Whereas the Orientals, they imagine the Sahaba just, knew about the hadith and they just made up asanid to, to attach it. And so it's arbitrary. Everyone just it's like algorithms. Everyone just makes up one and throws it in there and says, this is one, this is one. And the problem with this logic is that you're going to have contradictions, but it never happened. So we have to understand later, next week inshallah, we'll look how the isnad and the hadith criticism works. But once the asanid became popular, ilm jarh wa ta'dil became popular now and became a science that is known and practiced. The science of disparaging and appraising or assessing the narrators. And ilm jarh wa ta'dil is the essence of hadith sciences. Because by way of it, you get the tasheeh and tad'eef. You know who's authentic narrator, who's not, which chain of transmission is authentic, which hadith is not. And it's also what the ulama were busy with, grading, categorizing, assessing the narrators and the hadith. طيب. Now that we understand that the isnad came in time of the Sahaba, after the civil war, or the issue between Ali and Muawiyah, radiyallahu anhuma, scholars now they say, how did asanid spread? So we have to understand that the zaman al-riwayah, the period of narrating hadith, alongside writing it, this is called zaman al-riwayah. Riwayah means the narrations. So time of the Sahaba, it's zaman al-riwayah. They're narrating, hearing, and writing. So remember, every time you heard a hadith, you heard it first, and you wrote it. And you pass it like this, you heard it, and you give the person what you have written or what you have taken down in your books. This period, zaman al-riwayah, started at the time of the Sahaba, and ended approximately 5th century Hijri. Very important to know that, because we'll see later that that's the cutoff for the narration and the recording of the hadith, means the asanid being memorized and narrated. So year 1 until year 5 Hijri. So 5 centuries. Now the bulk of the riwayah was happening in years 1, 2, and 3. Then year 4 it got less, and year 5 of course it culminated like the time of Khatir al-Baghdadi, Ibn Abdul Barr, and others. You can see those books then are smaller, the hadith that they have that people before didn't have, or the fact that after that everyone relied upon what they wrote. So year 1 to year 5. Some ulama in their books they say year 1 to 3. But what's more correct that there were still some riwayah going on. For example, Imam al-Bayhaqi, rahimahullah, comes 4th century. He has so many ahadith. The Sunan al-Bayhaqi al-Kubra has maybe 25,000 ahadith. He heard all of those narrations. So clearly, he's up close to Ahmed's 40,000 or 30 plus thousand. So clearly, you have to acknowledge that it was still going on, but it was slowing down because all the hadith were being narrated. What's going on now is you're getting longer chains, or you're getting the books sometimes being given. Bin munawala. Someone will take the book and give it to you with ijaza. Although that wasn't happening too much in the earlier time. So year 1 to year 5, Sahaba narrated tabi'un to atba' and keeps going like this. So the rule is, the longer the time period, the number increase in transmitters or narrators. So if you have, for example, Abu Hurairah, then he has a student, and there'll be more students, and then more students. So by the time it gets to a later book, there's so many isnad, asanid for that one hadith. Let's give one example. Hadith Abu Hurairah, radiyallahu anhu, about Hadith Bukhari and Muslim, about when any one of you wakes up, let him not put his hand in a vessel until he washes it 3 times. Because he doesn't know where his hand was when he was asleep. This hadith is reported by Abu Hurairah, radiyallahu anhu, and 13 of his students. So Abu Hurairah and 13 tabi'un, they narrate from him. And these 13, 8 of them are in Medina, 1 of them is in Kufa, 1 in Basra, 1 in Yemen, 1 in Syria. So as you can see, Abu Hurairah is one man, then there's 13 different students. So it's growing this isnad. Because now if you have 13 already, you can see it's going to branch off, or sometimes it doesn't. After that, you have 16 scholars who transmitted in this hadith from Abu Hurairah's students. Again, different geographies. Some of them in Medina, Basra, Kufa, Mecca, Yemen, Khurasan, and Syria. The reason why this is important, if you make a chain for it, the scholars, they make sometimes something called fish diagram, or this kind of diagrams. You have the narrator, then you branch off, and then narrator, and you make these lines. If you look at the hadith, you just see, as the time progresses, it's getting bigger and bigger. And this is expected. The problem now, we're going to see later, Orientalists, when they see this, they have a problem, some of them. They say, why is it that every time progresses, the isnad is getting more and more longer and more detailed? So they thought, some of them, erroneously, that there's some kind of embellishment going on. As time progresses, the isnad get longer, but also stronger. Why? Because they want to make the isnad stronger, and they're going to make up new narrators, So every time there's a narrator, they'll add some more. Because we know the more narrator, stronger the hadith. So we're going to get to it later on, these kinds of backward thinking. But we know when we look at a chain of transmission by itself, and here I have a chart, you can't see it, but I want to share it. Just on one hadith, how many narrators narrated the hadith and how many times it came is proof that the isnad system is a sign from the signs of Allah. Because it's impossible to find this kind of level of mass transmission in any other religion, but also the detail that they used. Let's give one more example. Mustafa Azami in his book, he has two books. This one I'm going to quote on Sachs' Origins of Muhammadan Jurisprudence. This is the Orientalist, he refutes him. So in this book he mentions, for example, there's a hadith about Sifat Salah, how to pray Salah. Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, when Imam stands for Salah and he says Takbir, فَكَبِّرُوا, you say Takbir, he makes ruku' فَرْكَعُوا until the end of the Salah. So he's teaching us how to pray. This hadith is recorded 124 times with many dozens of scholars who took part in it. So 26 3rd century authorities reported the hadith in 10 different cities or locations. Medina, Mecca, Egypt, Basra, Syria, Yemen, Kufa, Wasit, Ta'if. So this question that we ask is, if this hadith Abu Hurairah narrated, then his students narrated, then they kept narrating, all 124 recording, they have the same wording. Have almost exactly the same wording in 10 different countries or cities from 124 times. And if you look at the isnad, it's huge, right? The different breakdowns. Also, it has cooperation. Ibn Umar has the same narration with Jabir, Aisha, and Ali. The question now, if these asanid were made up, is it possible then for the students of Abu Hurairah to then go and to have the same wording and to transmit it to others in different locations when they didn't know Abu Hurairah had the hadith, when they found it from Ibn Umar, for example, or they got it from Abu Hurairah from his student, and another independent teacher would teach it the same way to his student? So what they're finding is that the different locations, they couldn't transmit the wording to each other because there's no technology at that time. So when Abu Hurairah narrated to his students as is, and they kept it, and Ibn Umar narrated to his students as is, and then Aisha as well, all of these narrations have the same wording, which shows that each Sahabi is a common link, and each one narrated, because each one of them, when they brought the narration and they came, you would expect if it was a fabrication, there would be some changes going along the way, or introducing new meanings. But you won't find any of that. Not to mention that some of the students didn't meet each other. So the ulama, some of them will see later, this evidence that the hadith, the way it's read, only shows that the faithful tradition that the Sahaba had, and the Sahaba and the Tabi'un, that they would memorize and carry the way it is. In fact, their mistakes, they would also narrate the way it is. So for example, if someone heard it mawquf, he would never say marfu'. He would keep it mawquf. Although it would be better to say it's marfu'. You see, I'm saying this because later we'll find that if someone said hadith marfu', it's better for him, stronger. But he will say it the way he heard it. And the reason why this is important is because this guy that Mustafa Azim is refuting, he imagined that the Sahaba were the ones fabricating the hadith. But the problem, we find that the Sahaba, they're fabricating the hadith. How did they reach so many people to fabricate it to and keep them the same wording? The fact that other Sahaba corroborate the same hadith and they have different asanid. So Ibn Umar, for example, and Abu Hurairah, Aisha, and Jabir, and Ali, did they all come together to make the hadith wording sound the same? And all their students kept this pact? Or is it more likely that each of these narrators narrated as is and then the amana continued? But the fact that we have so much change of transmission for one hadith just gives you an idea how many hadith are there. Right? Again, when I say hadith, 124 times, one hadith. So 124 chains or 124 different times would count for that many times of narration. Which leads then to the question people always ask, how many hadith are there then? If it's so easy to narrate a hadith or to have more chains, how many are there? And this is where it gets interesting. Because the ulama, they differ. Reason being, it's so hard to figure out exactly how much. But it's not impossible. Tahdeed, ahadith, wa asanid can be done. First, asanid, change of transmission. Sheikh Diyar Rahman Azami, in his kitab al-Jami' al-Kam fi Hadith Sahih Shamil, page 50. And this book, brothers and sisters, he tries to compile every single hadith sahih possible. And a lot of the hadith he brings is the same hadith authenticated by Imam al-Albani. As we're going to see, there's an independent convergence here. Because some people come to Sheikh al-Albani, what was he doing? He was authenticating the hadith like his brothers were. But you don't know anything about hadith, so you think that he's just doing things. How many asanid, he says, Diyar Rahman Azami, based on his own experience, again, he spent years studying hadith, He says it's approximately 40,000 ahadith books. Firstly, 40,000 ahadith books. All right? 40,000 ahadith in the books. 40,000 ahadith in the books. And this, he says, is in terms of the actual matan. We're going to see with the isnad, there'll be more. And he says that these ahadith, 40,000 of them, 8,000 of them, they appear in the 6 books of hadith, 19,000 in Majma' al-Zawaid of Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, which is a book where he gathers the Zawaid, additional narrations not found in the 6 books. So Ahmad, Abu Ya'la, Al-Bazzar, he brings all those other narrations, Masanid. And he says from the remaining books, 10,000. So if you do the math, it's approximately, almost 40,000, not 100 exactly. So he says these are the number of hadith in the books if you were to actually look at the actual matan. I'm not talking about how the isnad makes it more. And what's interesting about this is based on his own counting. And to confirm this, he says, Hafiz Suyuti, I found, he says in Tadrib Rawi, volume 2, page 35, I found, he said, Imam Suyuti then says, the ahadith, sahih and weak, do not pass 100,000, they don't even pass 50,000. Allahu Akbar. So he says, when I counted it, and then I found Suyuti said, there's not more than 450. And how much is he saying? 40. And this shows you again, this Shaykh, what he's doing, following up the different narrations, and he's finding it by way of practical examination. So if you look at just the Matun, about 40,000 different weak, authentic narrations available. Now, when it comes to Asanid, since the Isnad is more, he says on page 51 of that book, that the Asanid, if you look at the numbers, then the Asanid for the Ahadith, just Ahadith only, are 300,000 marfu' Isnads, 300,000. So look at the difference here, 40,000 Hadith, 300,000 Asanid. So now we know, 1 Isnad, or 2 Isnad, 3 Isnad, for 1 Hadith will count as many Hadith. So only a Hadith, only marfu' means up to Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, 300,000. As for the statement Imam Bukhari rahimahullah that I compiled and authenticated 600, or I chose Sahih Bukhari from 600,000, what Imam Bukhari meant was marfu' al-marasil wal-mawquf, everything. So Imam Bukhari, when he says I had 600,000 hadith I chose from, he's talking about every narration he knew. Authentic narration, weak narration, mursal, marfu', all the categories. So that much from the Prophet ﷺ, that from the Sahaba, that which is a broken chain, he counted all of those. Now you can understand when they say Imam Ahmad knew 1 million hadith, وأسانيد means hadith, والمرفوع, والموقوف, والمرسل, etc. All of that. Now, how many narrators of hadith? Diyar Rahmani says, according to his estimation, he has a whole book on this. Can you imagine? He says there's 50,000 hadith narrators. And he has a mawsu'a, wallahu a'lam, when it's going to come out, where he brings every single narrator and his grading, his history, his biography, and his grading, in order to write this book. Students, brothers and sisters, when we hear something like this is Islam. Not some people today who don't know anything about religion. He's compiling 50,000 narrators to do this job. Sounds like when Imam al-Albani rahimahullah said, I compiled 40 volumes to do Sahih al-Jami', just to authenticate it. Because I first had to find where Suyuti got all the hadith from. I collected the asanid, then I did the work. So when Shaykh al-Albani says Sahih in Sahih al-Jami', we don't have nothing to say on that. Because you have no idea where he got it from. Just like Sahih, when he says authentic, you got to go and look, because he brings so much for you to work with. And this is the respect for the ulama. But also very interesting, because it also shows you can actually enumerate the different narrators and how you can check, because that's what he was trying to do in this book. His job in this book, Jami' al-Kamil, was to figure out if it's possible, and inshallah he is, because this is his final book before he died, that he brought all the ahadith sahihah in one book. And we're going to see what number he came with at the end. So the summary of this section, 40,000 ahadith in the books, 300,000 marfu' asanid, and 50,000 narrators. Which then leads to the next question, how many are authentic? Because this is what people want to know. We want to know the sahih hadith. So the scholars, they say now, there is some difficulty in calculating the authentic hadith because there is some elements of ijtihad. Tasheeh and tad'eef al-hadith is based on the scholars' differences of what they believe to be authentic or not, based on the narratives and science of hadith. Next week we'll talk about it. So it's not arbitrary, right? It's based on the science. But let's look at two examples of how to look at this. First way of calculating it. Some of the scholars from the Salaf, they said that all the hadith are either 4,000 or 4,400. What do they mean by this? Sahih hadith. And now it brings a little bit of a problem when you think about it without explaining it, but some may say, how is that possible? But we're going to explain. 4,000 or 4,400. All the hadith sahih. Hafiz ibn Rajab, he brings the Jami' Ulum al-Hikam, volume 2, page 58. Imam Abu Dawud al-Sijistani, rahimahullah, said, I examined the Musnad ahadith and I found them to be 4,000. Yeah, some of us probably read that. When you read the Jami' al-Hikam, mentions this. And then he says, from the 4,000, 4 of them are the whole deen. So some of the scholars say, how did he say 4,000 when he knew 500,000? And you guys know, Imam Abu Dawud knew 500,000 hadith. At that time, that was a hafid, 500,000. That was the bare minimum. So he knew that much, but when he meant 4,000, as-sahih, authentic, ahadith. Imam al-San'ani, he writes in Tawdih al-Afkar, page 63 and 64, Fa'ida, benefit, Hafiz ibn Hajar said, and he brings a chain of transmission, that one of the earlier scholars said, right, so it goes all the way up, and it says in that narration that Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan, Ibn Mahdi, wa Ahmad bin Hanbal, and others, they said, the ahadith sahiha, that are musnada, until Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, until him, reaching him, are 4,000 wa 4,400 ahadith. This is what it is. And then he says, San'ani, يعني الصحيحة, بلا تكرار, without being repeated. 4,400 and 4,400. So whose view is that? Ahmed ibn Mahdi, Abdurrahman Mahdi, Yahya bin Sa'id Qattan, and also Abu Dawud. Now someone will look at this and say, brother, you just told us there's a book full of hadith sahih, and they're not 4,000. So this is where some of the ulama, when they look at this, they say, well, we have to explain what they're trying to say. But one way of looking at it is that maybe, wallahu a'lam, what was intended by this is that the ahadith which are muttafaq, which are agreed upon their authenticity, are 4,000 or so. Between 4 and 5,000, 100% authentic. باتفاق العلماء. يعني علماء hadith. So if you interpret it this way, this makes more sense. Because there are other ahadith which are ijtihadi, يعني someone makes it sahih, someone tad'if. Hence, the scholars say hadith authenticity are 3 types. Number 1, a hadith everyone agrees authentic. Like Bukhari, Muslim, Sahihain, Muttafaqun alayh, no one doubts it. Number 2, a hadith everyone agrees weak. يعني موضوع, somebody made up a hadith. So many of the hadith you find that are strange in the wordings and make no sense, most likely is da'if. And we'll talk about later how do you know if it's weak or not. Even with using your aql. Right? Because some of the Orientalists, they like doing this. Some of those are, pseudo-liberals, they come and say, we're so smart, look at this hadith. And it's not even hadith. I was talking about eggplant. The hadith is about this, the eggplant. I know, it's like some fadail for the eggplant. It's like, come on, And they try to use example to make tashwish of the deen. And if it was authentic, anyway, they wouldn't take it. So it doesn't even matter, right? They just want to say, look. So we have to remember, when you hear those hadith, we'll see later the criteria. And the third one, which is bulk of the hadith, differed over the authenticity. Scholars differed. How did they differ? Next week we'll look at it. What's the science of hadith about? So let me show you now that it's possible to say that all the authentic hadith are this much. Shaykh Abdul Muhsin al-Qasim, the Imam in Masjid Nabawi, he has a 3-volume book you can find on his website called Jami' Bayn al-Sahihain. So he compiles 3 books. All the hadith muttafaqun alayh, Ifrad al-Bukhari, Ifrad al-Muslim. Hadith agreed upon Bukhari Muslim, hadith separate, only Bukhari narrated, hadith only narrated by Muslim. And so if you put them together, you get all the hadith in Bukhari Muslim which are not repeated. So what are the numbers? Why the ulama? This is how some ulama memorize the hadith. If someone told you you're going to memorize Sahihain, this is how they do it. Lu'la Marjan, Muttafaqun alayh, then Ifrad al-Bukhari, Ifrad al-Muslim. So you have all the Sahihain without repeat. And then you go and do the rest of the books. And we'll show you. So look at this for example. His book, I was checking, he says Muttafaqun alayh, what's agreed upon Bukhari and Muslim are 1693. So you can write that down, 1693. See if it makes sense here. 1693 hadith. He says Muttafaqun alayh, Bukhari and Muslim. And he has all the manuscripts, everything, because it's sometimes different. He says Ifrad al-Bukhari, the hadith only Bukhari narrates, are 593. So Bukhari and Muslim agreed upon 1,693. So 1693 agreed upon. Bukhari narrates singularly, only he has it, is 593. 593. And then a hadith only Muslim has are 553. So 1693 agreed upon, 593 al-Bukhari only, 553 Muslim only. You put them together, you get 2839. 2,839 hadith. 2839. So that's in Bukhari and Muslim, no repeat. Now, go to the book As-Sahih Musnad bima laysa bi Sahihain, Imam al-Wadi'i. Shaykh Muqbil rahimahullah, this book, he wrote it to prove that there are authentic hadith, more than one or few, that are sahih outside Bukhari and Muslim. And you have to read his muqaddimah, very important. He said, when I was in Jami' Islamiyah, my teacher said in hadith class, that hadith is authentic outside Bukhari and Muslim, you can count in your hands. And since that day, he said, I never forgot, that was not right. So he went to prove it. Right? And he has two books, Jami' Sahih and Sahih Musnad. When you look at Sahih Musnad, it's very, very strict. Shaykh Muqbil's conditions, only Sahih lidati or Hasan lidati, and no shubuhat whatsoever. So when you read the Muqaddimah, you see what he was doing. He's trying to prove without doubt. What's his total? The fourth taba'ah, the fourth edition before after he passed away, it was printed, 1658. That's his total. 1,658 authentic hadith, not in Bukhari Muslim. From Abu Dawood and Ahmed and Tabarani and you name it. Right? So Shaykh Muqbil did a great service from Ummah, rahimahullah, rahmatu wasi'ah. So put them together, 2839 plus 1658, you get 4,497. Close? Right? Close, right? And this is important. The Salaf, what they were saying then was what? Wallahu alam. What Imam San'ani said, the ulama said, is that it's probably muttafaq, what's agreed upon. And some bahithun today say it's about 5,000. Absolutely marfu', authentic. Asl hadith means this is the asl. Every other hadith is a ziyada or additional wording to this or has origin in this. And this is pretty cool because if you can tell me there's a hadith not in Bukhari Muslim or the books, there are 6 books of hadith, which is authentic, I don't dispute, but we're going to say that if it's weak or authentic, at least its origin can be found in one of these books. Some of the ulama say anything in 6 books of hadith, all the hadith are really there, either in origin or in its meaning. And we'll see that later. So the total, based on this number, 4,497. This is what? Agreed upon, inshallah ta'ala, 100% authentic of the highest degree. Because Bukhari, Muslim are authentic, and Sahih Muslim, Shaykh Muqbil put the highest standards. He didn't put any hadith, he puts no hasan ghayri, no ijtihad. It has to be pure. طيب, if that's the case, how about those who did ijtihad and tried to do more, like Shaykh Al-Albani, rahimahullah, and Diyar Rahman Al-Azami and others? What did they get? So Shaykh Diyar Rahman and Shaykh Al-Albani, others, they bring way more hadith. So Shaykh Al-Azami, he says, look, there's about 12,000 to 15,000 ahadith sahihah. Right? His estimation, 12 to 15,000. Okay? In Jami' Kamil, page 52. Diyar Rahman Al-Azami, he says about 12 to 15,000. But if you told me how many of them are purely sahih without dispute, it's between 8 to 10 at the very least. 8 to 10. This is without any real ijtihad, or like too much ijtihad or too much differing. But with differing, it goes more. His final conclusion in his tarkhis of the book, he mentions 1,000 or 16,546 hadith. Authentic, according to him. Hasan, Ghayri, Sahih, Hasan Lidati, Bishawahid, anything you could think of. It's 16,546. Which are hadith Sahihah, inshaAllah. Which is very interesting. Because Shaykh Al-Albani, what was his total number? If you go to the kitab, Sahih Al-Albani, by Muhammad Hassan Abdul Hamid al-Shaykh, contemporary Shaykh, he gathered every single authentic hadith Shaykh Al-Albani had, which he went back, but didn't go back on. Because Shaykh Al-Albani used to change some rulings, right? So he did what Shaykh Al-Albani was trying to do his whole life. One book, all hadith. 3 volumes, subhanAllah, it's great. He said, I hope I achieved the Shaykh's goal. Because all the books Shaykh Al-Albani has are all supposed to go in that project. Taqreeb al-Sunnah Bayna Yaday al-Ummah. So he says, look, all of it, and again, you can get this book in PDF, Sahih Al-Albani. It's 16,004. Allahu Akbar, it's not too far from him, right? 16,004, and he has 16,546. And what's interesting about that is that's with the ijtihad, extra effort, differing going on. Even more interesting, Ibn Salah in Muqaddimah, he writes, an early scholar, Najmuddin al-Qumuri, a Shafi'i scholar, who says that the hadith sahiha altogether are 14,000. See, look at this. Najmuddin al-Qumuri, a Shafi'i, Ibn Salah cites him saying, all hadith sahiha are 14,000. And our ulama come today and say 16,000. And some ignorant person will come to you and say, Shaykh Alban, what was he doing? What in the world are you doing? Right? That's the question. You don't even know anything about hadith. You don't even know what the ulama were doing. Someone is coming today and thinking Shaykh Alban is doing something no one did before. What he's trying to do is trying to prove, with the chains of transmission and the science that left for us, how we know the authentic hadith are authentic. Because brothers and sisters, ilm al-hadith was always ijtihadi. And this is something we have to pay attention to, those who say you can't do ijtihad. There are some people out there who say it's done. The mutaqaddimin, they already give us a ruling, that's it. We say no. Because you ask them, what year did mutaqaddimin end? They say 3rd century. I just told you, Zaman al-Riwayah ended 5th century. So you already made up something. And this is why it's so important to know these numbers just for our own confidence. But also to figure out that if the ulama were coming to the independent researchers and coming to something similar, then yes, the hadith sciences can continue to be authenticated, reanalyzed until Yawm al-Qiyamah. The last point, when finished for today, because of time, how do we know, or how is hadith graded in summary? And next week we'll carry out a more detailed discussion. So last point for today, a hadith grading. So if we say there's 16,000 or so hadith which are sahih according to the scholars who did the effort, how do you know hadith sahih? Ulama said 5 conditions. 5. For the hadith which is sahih and hasan as well, because hasan will also have the same condition but this lower level. First condition, ittisalu sanad. So it has to have a connected isnad. So ittisalu sanad means that the actually chain transmission goes from A to B all the way. No disconnects anywhere. Number 2, you have to have narratives who are trustworthy and righteous. Al-adala, trustworthy and righteous. Trustworthy in their carrying of narrations and in their deen. Hence, the narration of Ahl-Bid'ah were examined to see if there was any compromise for their trustworthiness, even though they might be trustworthy, but would they support innovations that they were upon, for example. Number 4, the precision and accuracy of narratives. Dabtul ruwat. The ruwat narratives, they have to have dabt. And dabt means 2 things. Hifd wal kutub. Their heart and memorization, what's in their chest and what's in their books. So if he got old, he can read from his book. If he has good memory, he would read from his memory. But if there's a discrepancy between the 2, or if he had one over the other, they will see if they could take it. These 2 are the most important conditions when it comes to the actual narrators. Adala wa dabt. We'll see in a second. Number 4, no irregularities or inconsistencies. So abnormal narrations have extra wordings or wordings which are only found there, or maybe opposing anyone else. So adam al-shudud. Shudud means here this narration it's opposing someone or groups who are stronger in narration and memorization. And last, number 5, no hidden defect. Adam al-illah, and this is the most important subject for the seniors or the most advanced scholars. They focus on the ilal. Hidden defects mean you will not be able to tell. Kind of like money counterfeits, right? The ulama say, example, muhaddith is like a money lender or a currency buyer and seller. He just has to see it to know it's weak or fake. Or me and you, we just walk around with fake money, right? Right? So he would know, right? So this is why the ilal is so tricky. If someone has all this, or narration has all this, it's sahih. If the adala or the dabt, 2 or 3, condition 2 or 3 are lessened or weakened, but still there, the hadith becomes hasan. This is the theory. If it's all perfect, the highest degree, it's sahih. If conditions 2 and 3, the righteousness and trustworthiness or the accuracy goes down a little bit, it becomes hasan. If those get more compromised, then we keep going and we start seeing that you need backup, you need support. The last point I want to mention is that you can't authenticate hadith by the isnad alone. You need to have the matan checked. Because what about conditions 4 and 5 and even 1? So condition 1 applies to the narrative and the text. Right? The fact that if a text is authentic all the way through, but it has a problem because it's disconnected, because it's hidden defect. So mostly 4 and 5 apply to the matan. No irregularities, which means that you're going to check against another person's narration. Ibn Qayyim now, Kitab Furusiyya. He writes, and Kitab Furusiyya is a very interesting book because it's not about hadith, but he mentions some interesting rules in there. Ibn Qayyim writes in page 245 that the knowledge of authenticity of isnad is not a condition, or knowing the authenticity of isnad is not a condition for authenticity of hadith. Rather, we must also check for the authenticity of the wording or the method. For there are conditions which apply to it too. So you need to have authenticity of a chain, being free from any hidden defect, free of abnormalities or any weaknesses that are found by contradiction. And last one, nakara, somebody narrated something who is weak memorization, or he makes mukhalafa of a group bigger than him. So this is very important for us because Imam al-Qayyim, what he's telling us, hadith criticism is also part of it, is matan criticism. So we do jarh and ta'deel of the isnad wal matan. And here, Shaykh A'zami says that this is an important benefit because it is also showing that we don't authenticate hadith by the ruwat alone. So many of us, if you check a hadith, the mistake someone make, he checks the whole chain, checks the books of Ilm al-Rijal and says, okay, isnad sahih. No, that's isnad is sahih, not hadith sahih. Why? Because what's the next step? Check if the hadith is sahih. And next week we're going to look, inshallah, at this more. And we have to understand how the ulama knew who's the narrator. How did they know the narrator is authentic? What did they use to double check if the narrator or the matan is actually authentic? Is there blind following going on? And the reason why this is important, brothers and sisters, this next part next week, inshallah, in order to understand the Orientalist criticism, you must understand how hadith works. And the thing is that if we don't understand how it works, then what we'll have is a confusion because the Oriental is going to make big claims. It's going to make big claims and it's going to bring proof. And so one thing that we start noticing that if we don't even know, for example, what the ulama were doing, it just looks like that Imam Bukhari said this person is reliable. How does he know? The guy died before him. So some people say, astaghfirullah, Bukhari just said this guy's thiqah. He didn't meet him. As if Bukhari, just where did he get it from? His dream? He didn't say that by himself. He has a chain tradition where he got it from. But also, how did he double check if his teacher said he's reliable? For example, if his teacher said this person is reliable, how did Bukhari know that he's not wrong too? So we're going to see the ulama have an internal system. Today, the Orientalist, the biggest Shaykh al-Hadith of the Orientalists, he agrees with us, right? In some ways, not 100%, but he agrees with our system. And we're going to show that as we go along, inshallah. Anyone have any quick questions? Otherwise, the salah, yes. So we said that, so the narration, Sammu lana rijalukum. How do we know 100% he was talking about that? We said narration Muslim number 24. Abu Ishaq, he says, when they, that's why the Rafidah, were narrated things after Ali, may Allah be pleased with him, a man from the companions of Ali would say, may Allah curse them, did they corrupt every type of knowledge? Means ilm al-hadith. So the ulama say the narration came before Ibn Sirin's narration. So Ibn Sirin's number 27, Muslim, Muqaddimah his 24. Abu Ishaq is talking context, something was being said by Ali that's not true. Hence, they had to double check. And who is this? Two groups of people were lying. The Khawarij and the Rafidah. And the Rafidah came later, but the Khawarij were there at that time. So some would say it's probably more the Khawarij, because they're the ones who were saying things about Ali, and they're the ones who made the fitna worse. Hence why the Sahaba died was the Khawarij. They were fighting on the side of Ali, and really killing the Sahaba, subhanAllah. That's what they were doing. So some of the ulama said this was what was happening. But the Orientalists, the problem we have, they have no proof for their claim. They just come and say things like, well, there was lots of infighting later. And so Ibn Sirin says, they used to say, who is they? What year did he die? So you can see that the Orientalist often, he would first assume something in order to create the doubt. He has to first, take it for granted. We're going to say, we don't even accept that from you. We need a chain, right? So alhamdulillah, this has a chain too, so it's not like we don't have a chain for it. And last questions? Yes? Yeah, so we're going to talk about that later at the end. Some people, when they do meta criticism, they use the aql. Can you use the aql? Yes and no. There's rules. And there's even a hadith about that. If you see a hadith, you know it's weak. And Shaykh Islam Taymiyyah, Kitab Minhaj al-Sunnah, he has qawa'id and shurut in there. Anyone wants to see, because the Rafidah have all kinds of hadith. And they say these are authentic. And you just listen to the hadith and say, astaghfirullah azim. Only someone, the aql like theirs, will say it's sahih. So Shaykh Islam Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim say, there is a logical component. It is so interesting. But the problem is you can't expand it. So for example, if someone says it doesn't make sense to me, that's not a hujjah. Or, I don't like it. And we'll see later that was the way of the Mu'tazila. Bishr Mirisi here, he mentions, the Imam Darimi in Rad ala Bishr Mirisi, he mentions, Bishr Mirisi has a qa'idah. It was a qa'idah, one day a student came to him, to Bishr, and said, how can we deal with Ahl Hadith? Whenever they tell us something, they say a hadith. So we can't just reject the hadith. He said, listen, when they bring you hadith, first doubt its authenticity. And if it's authentic, make ta'wil of it. Allah, that's the qa'idah Mu'tazili till today. Bring you hadith, it's da'if, it's a Muslim. Okay, it means something else. That's how he does it. There's no other way around. Because if you say, I don't accept it, kafir. Denying hadith muttafaqun alayh. Imagine, hadith absolute authenticity, he looks terrible. And also, he told Bishr this because Bishr was telling them that. So Bishr said, look, this is how we're going to do it. Wallahi, today, if you look at all the groups that are falling into liberalism or other extremism, that's their methodology. So alhamdulillah, we'll see that ulama, they knew our sharaf, brothers and sisters in Isnad, as Ibn Mubarak rahimahullah said, al-isnadu min ad-din, wa lawla isnadu, laqala man sha'u ma sha'. Isnad is from the deen. If it wasn't for that, anyone will say whatever he wants. Barakallahu feekum. Subhanallah, bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik.